And if it's past that, we can leave.
I'm just trying to
No matter how low it is,
exit the
even if you go in front of the gap.
Okay.
Amy, good morning. Have a leaf.
We saved you a seat.
We'll know what's in the picture.
Should be good.
I'll put it in.
It's not widescreened. Yeah. It needs to be full screen.
It is. It's full screen because it's top to bottom.
Okay, but we've cut off half of the image.
Well, good morning to all of you who are here today and to the people who are joining via the live stream. Now it is very exciting today to basically have, the Bicentennial of St. Thomas, 200 years since the foundation of our community was concluded like 2 weeks ago. But we had one final we wanted to mark the conclusion of the Bicentennial with one final lecture. And as it happens, it's not been calculated, but it's incredible. Today is the feast of the dedication of St. Thomas Church. So it's quite, I think, there is no better way of celebrating this birthday than having a lecture on the architectural history of St. Thomas Church. The other reason why I'm particularly delighted about this lecture is that Cole, guest speaker, he's a new parishioner, so you have been coming for
About a year.
About a year here. So we started to talk. As soon as I discovered he was an architect, I said, "Oh my God, so interesting! Can you explain? Can you help me to understand this church? Because it's." So we started to have conversations about this, and it came really natural to ask him to give this lecture today. I have to say, Cole has already said it also in the handout. We are really immensely grateful to Inge Rice, who is here today, and Francis Bluin, archivists, for the work they've done over years, which allows this to happen, because without them having really catalogued and unearthed so much material, like even from archives, this would not have been possible. Just about Cole, I have to say, he's a historical research specialist at the Robert A.M. Stern Architects. So he does this as a job. So we are really in very good hands, I think. So
I'll
Cole,
do my best.
Up to you.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for coming to this lecture on St. Thomas Church. It is a great privilege and a deep joy to take on the role of interlocutor between you and this church, and I hope to be able to provide both an introduction to St. Thomas for those of you who have not had the pleasure of getting to know the church yet, and hopefully provide some new perspectives for those of you for whom St. Thomas has been a familiar friend. My goal for our time together is to demonstrate how St. Thomas is heir, not just in form, but in practice to its medieval precedents. The great Gothic cathedrals of France and England were not completed as one builds a house, or even as most of the tall towers we see going up around us here in New York. Instead, they have lived lives that last well past their completion dates, stretching across centuries of sponsors, churchmen, craftsmen, and calamities. For example, the Cathedral of Notre-Dame d'Amiens commenced construction in the year 1220 after the previous church burned down. The roofs were completed between 1284 and 1305, and the north tower was only completed in 1406. Structural problems meant that iron chains had to be installed in 1498 between the piers, and in 1528 a lightning bolt struck the spire, igniting it just like Notre-Dame de Paris did in 2019, necessitating the building of the current one. As we will discover in this lecture, St. Thomas has had its own life. Great craftsmen and architects designing buildings and fires bringing those churches back down. St. Thomas has not had a single location for many centuries, although we're working on that, in the same manner as the French or English cathedrals, but its story will show that this parish very much belongs to this medieval Gothic tradition of church building, with one notable difference. The people whose names we know at Amiens were the master masons responsible for the entire project at different phases of its time. Robert de Lusache, Thomas de Gromont, and his son Renaud, and so forth. The other, more minor elements of the church can only be loosely associated with occasionally named craftsmen and are identified largely by the localized styles in which they worked. It is not so for St. Thomas. Thanks to our temporal proximity, it is our privilege to be able to get to know many of the ancillary figures of the building. From donors and architects to churchmen and craftsmen, we now know and appreciate the many talents of the individuals who have labored on this church and its predecessors. Through getting to know the ancillary buildings, art, and character of the people whose craft made St. Thomas happen, we can come to a new understanding of and appreciation for this church. At the first meeting of the St. Thomas Vestry held on January 14, 1824, it was unanimously resolved that it is expedient for this corporation to make immediate arrangements for building a church. A location was selected on the northwest corner of Broadway and Houston Street, comprising 3 lots on Broadway itself and 2 fronting Houston. Then as now, St. Thomas was adjacent to the original St. Patrick's Cathedral, which was situated in Prince and Mott Streets and which had been dedicated in 1815. This was an unconventional location for a new church, as it was quite far removed from the center of New York at the time. A contemporary description of the site characterized the neighborhood as a rural suburb, where large open fields stretched off yonder, old country seats still held their place, and running streams diversified the landscape, and groves of patriarchal trees were in sight. In April of 1824, the vestry resolved that the order of the proposed church be Gothic, and plans of a church of 62 by 90 feet be procured from artists with estimates of the expense. This Gothic was a bold move for ecclesiastical architecture in New York at the time and beyond. In the city, Trinity, Christ Church, St. Michael's, and St. James were simpler wooden structures, while St. Paul's Chapel and St. Mark's in the Bowery were heavily influenced by English classical models, such as the works of Sir Christopher Wren. The architect of this church, as written on the cornerstone, was the Reverend John McVicker, a professor of political economy and theology at Columbia who had been corresponding with the Founding Fathers and was a noted enthusiast of Gothic architecture. However, the actual designer of the building was a man called Josiah R. Brady, a notable ecclesiastical architect of the time. Most of his works have been torn down, but his 1823 Episcopal Church of St. Luke and St. Simon Cyrene in Rochester remains and is Rochester's oldest building for public use. Brady's design called for a stone Gothic building with 2 towers projecting 12 feet from the front of the building. John Walden Meyer, an architectural historian writing in 1940, noted that while St. Thomas may not have been the first building of the Gothic revival in New York, it was the first important one, setting a precedent for the rest of the city by building a structurally Gothic building as opposed to merely applying Gothic forms to a non-Gothic frame. It has certainly set a precedent for St. Thomas. This church was consecrated on February 23, 1826, and the completed building had been lengthened by about 13 feet and had a 3-story rectory added to it on the corner of Mercer and Houston Streets. The new building was described by a youthful Arthur Cleveland Cox, who would go on to become Bishop of Western New York. Cox was struck by the picturesque experience. It looked like a sort of castle with its 2 towers and its stone walls. What finished, I imagined it a small Westminster Abbey. I first saw its interior on Christmas Day, and it affected me more than the great cathedrals of Europe have ever affected me since. The roof imitated an open roof very successfully, the great trusses between the bays being real, and ornamenting the walls with fine effect. The beautifully adorned pulpit hung upon the wall with a gorgeous canopy and niche doorway in the rear. Far up over it, a rose window occupying the triangle made by the open roof was the organ loft. The building achieved great notoriety as one of the finest churches in New York, as noted by contemporary guidebooks. The choice of location had proved to be prescient. In the 2 years that had elapsed since the cornerstone was laid, the rural character of the area had turned into a residential one, which was good for building up the congregation. This increase was appreciated both for the St. Thomas community and by the treasurer. Construction had not been cheap. The vestry had hoped to raise the necessary money for the building of the church through donations, and almost none had materialized. Instead, the church turned to funding the construction costs, which had come to over $50,000, roughly $1.5 million today, through a mortgage which would be paid through the auctioning of pews. Even after the auction, some $32,000 had to be made up, and this accumulation of debt would be an albatross around the parish's neck through the 1830s and 1840s, impacting the building's maintenance and upgrades. The congregation's size also faced competition from other notable Episcopal parishes that had moved uptown, such as Grace Church in 1843 and Calvary in 1847. St. Thomas's situation would go from bad to worse on Sunday, March the 2nd, 1851, when the building caught fire. The oak timber vaulted roof that young Cox had admired 30 years previously burned from midnight until 3 the next day, destroying the interior and the south tower. This fire, while calamitous, would prove to have silver linings. The church was insured, and the proceeds from the claim were used to pay down the mortgage on the property, freeing St. Thomas of debt. It also afforded St. Thomas its first opportunity to move. Over the preceding 2 decades, New York's population had tripled thanks to waves of Irish and German immigrants fleeing famine and political unrest. This meant that the formerly bucolic countryside location had entirely been surrounded by a neighborhood that was part business district, part slum. It was considered and even voted on that St. Thomas should move uptown, but before that could happen, a neighbor of St. Thomas, one Gerard Stuyvesant, offered to help rebuild the church so that he could preserve his lawn. The option to stay came with considerable financial benefits and significantly less hassle, so the path of least resistance was taken and St. Thomas's move uptown was delayed. The new church was designed by the firm of Wills and Dudley, 2 English-born architects who were significant designers of Episcopalian Gothic churches throughout America. Local examples of their work include St. George's Church in Flushing and St. James Episcopal Church and Parish House in the Bronx, both national landmarks. Dudley and Wills adhered to the original layout of St. Thomas, a twin tower design with the large central bay, with minor differences in crenellation along the gables. The interior was largely the same as well. The only major difference was a relocation of the organ to the east end of the building. The rebuilt church was consecrated on April 3, 1852. However, the social pressures that had precipitated the original vote to move the church were only growing. A combination of the squalor of the immediate neighborhood and both the greater distances and growing size of the congregation meant that a move from the Houston Street location was inevitable. The process of the move was first formally explored in 1859, but problems relating to the rights of burial vault holders meant that the process of moving only got underway in 1865. As in 1824, the move was fortuitously timed to take advantage of New York's upswing. The conclusion of the Civil War in 1865 hailed the arrival of the Gilded Age in America, and there was no better place to be during the Gilded Age than Fifth Avenue. The rector of St. Thomas at the time, Dr. William Ferdinand, accurately foretold that the last vestiges of ancient farms and homesteads would disappear, and even before the stopstone of our temple can possibly be brought and laid, our range of observation and prospect will be cut off. Walls of domestic architecture will hem us in on every side. Swarming and compact life will be upon us and around us and pressing eagerly beyond us. Little did he know how prescient this forecast of what Fifth Avenue would be actually was. The architect for the new Fifth Avenue location was Richard Upjohn, a towering figure in Episcopalian church building history. Born in 1802 in Shaftesbury near Dorset in the United Kingdom, Upjohn apprenticed as a builder and cabinet maker before moving to Massachusetts in 1829. After some time building mansions in the Boston area, his first church commission was for St. John's Episcopal Church in Bangor, Maine, completed in 1836 and sadly destroyed by fire in 1911. Upjohn was then invited to New York to make alterations to Trinity Church in the financial district, which ultimately turned into a completely new design, the current building completed in 1846. Even before completion, the commission was Upjohn great accolades and was the beginning of a prolific career of church building. He designed over 50 churches, almost all in Gothic revival style across America from the 1840s through the 1870s. In New York City, he also designed the Church of the Ascension in Greenwich Village, completed in 1841, and Christ Church in Cobble Hill, completed in 1842. Upjohn is also notable for being one of the founding members of the American Institute of Architects and serving as its inaugural president from 1857 to 1876, as well as writing an extremely influential architectural book, Upjohn's Rural Architecture. Upjohn first began work on St. Thomas in 1865, when vestry minutes note that the rector exhibited plans for the new church and rectory. However, these plans would not be adopted until 1867. The new building was organized around its massive corner tower, setting the precedent for the block-defining massing that St. Thomas exhibits today. Another major feature is the large rose window of the facade, carried over from the first and second churches, and which would be passed down to the Cram and Goodhue design. Upjohn's plan was also notable. The church itself was cruciform, but the crossing, as opposed to being the standard intersection of nave and transept, was an octagon. The polygonal apse occupied the eastward direction, and the four semi-apses contained the organ, and with the final space containing gables. The second St. Thomas also set precedents for the quality of the interior artwork and decoration. The reredos of the church were by a noted Irish-American sculptor, Augustus Saint-Gaudens, who studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the most important school of art and architecture at the time. He would become most well known for his statues and reliefs commemorating Union generals in Boston, Chicago, and New York. The reredos were flanked by murals by another great artist, Jean Lafarge. Lafarge was a multi-talented figure, best known for his stained glass installations around the United States and in England. Examples of his stained glass in New York can be seen at St. Paul's Chapel at Columbia University, the National Arts Club, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where he collaborated extensively with Louis Tiffany. This combination of artistic and architectural talent was noted in the news covering the opening of the church as the first in American church building. In the case of St. Thomas, it would not be the last. The new St. Thomas opened on October 6, 1870, and was lauded as an architectural success. It could accommodate 2,000 worshippers and was described as a spacious and commodious structure where the aesthetic and the practical are combined with a skill rarely equaled. The exterior has the magnificence of a cathedral, and the church set a precedent for vestries that wish to avail themselves of the best results in modern ecclesiology. It was one of Richard Upjohn's final designs before his death in 1878, and his last major one. This church served its congregation until August 8, 1905, when at 6 o'clock in the morning, another fire broke out. Within half an hour of the outbreak, the roof caved in, and by the time the fire burnt itself out, the only remains of the church left standing were the bell tower and the walls of the apse and the nave. All the interior furnishings and details, including the Lafarge murals and the St. Gaudens reredos, were completely consumed. Only a few pieces of liturgical equipment survived the fire, including the large gilt cross that is still at the high altar today. Rebuilding at the same location was initially not in question. The day of the fire, the rector, Dr. Ernest Stiers, announced that services would continue in a temporary structure, that there would be another church at the same site, that it would be a Gothic building, and finally that an offer of $50,000 had already been made towards funding the new church. The actual decision to build an entirely new church came in September, when a committee for plan and scope was appointed and consulted the architect George B. Post, a noted Beaux-Arts classicist who was responsible for the Cornelius Vanderbilt II mansion just up the road on the feasibility of the restoration of the Upjohn building. Post indicated that while the Upjohn church could be restored at a price of $300,000 and a new building would cost roughly double that, a new church could be built with a better material than the original sandstone and made more fireproof as well. This push for a new building was also animated by Post's personal distaste for the Upjohn church, which he rather aggressively characterized as the least satisfactory and interesting of all the designs of the late Richard Upjohn. The committee was convinced and unanimously voted to commission a new design for the church. This decision led to several false starts. Firstly, a question of moving even further uptown was raised. In 1905, businesses and grand hotels were already replacing residential buildings along Fifth Avenue, and a number of the parishioners themselves had moved uptown. There was also the value of the land itself to consider. At $2.5 million, its sale could have been highly profitable. A site on the northeastern corner of 5th Avenue and 63rd Street was very nearly committed to. Luckily, the purchase was not possible. The second question regarded how to select a designer for the new church. The architectural program had been decided, a church, a parish house, and a rectory, and the style was again to be Gothic. A competition was decided as the best method to obtain a design for the building, and such experts as Frank Miles Day of the Philadelphia firm of Day & Clowder and the architects William Aiken and R. Clipson Surgis were selected as consultants. All were experts in Gothic architecture. Invitations were sent to 9 major architecture firms around the country, but no design initially proved satisfactory, with the result that all were rejected. However, the firm of Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson got a second chance, delivering the design on the right and on the cover of your handouts. Plans for the new church were unveiled and explained at a meeting of the vestry on May 16, 1907 by Cram, and approval was granted 11 days later. Now, an introduction to the two architects. Ralph Adams Cram was born on December 16, 1863 in Hampton Falls, New Hampshire, into a family of Unitarians. Cram was educated at home where his father, the minister William A. Cram, maintained a library including Kant, Hegel, Spinoza, and most relevant, John Ruskin, the famed writer on Gothic architecture. Cram was particularly drawn to the 7 Lamps of Architecture and the Stones of Venice by Ruskin, showing interest in his descriptions of the churches. He received his first architectural drawing book on his 15th birthday, and at 17, after graduating from Exeter, his father went to Boston and showed the young Cram's portfolio to William Ware, founder of the architecture school at MIT. Ware knew a recent École des Beaux-Arts grad named Arthur Roch and referred Cram to work in his firm as an unpaid apprentice, beginning 5 years at Roch and Tilden between 1881 and 86. A competition entry that he did not win in 1886 nevertheless granted him a payout of $500, enabling the beginning of trips to Europe, a turning point for Cram. After attending a Christmas Eve Mass in Rome, Cram was inspired to turn away from the Unitarianism of his father and embrace the High Mass. After further stops in Sicily and Venice, Cram returned to Boston, ready to enter the world of architecture. Again, he lacked funds. A second-place finish for an addition to Charles Bulfinch's Massachusetts State House netted him $1,300, and a lucky encounter saw him meet another independently minded draughtsman named Charles Francis Wentworth, and the two entered into the public competition for the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in 1889. While they did not win, it solidified the working partnership. The office of Cram and Wentworth opened the same year. Bertram Grosvenor Goodhue had a similar origin story. Goodhue was born on April 28, 1869, in the ancestral home of the Grosvenors in Pomfret, Connecticut. He was the descendant of a notably American family. He had 5 ancestors aboard the Mayflower and 6 who served in the Revolutionary War, including one immortalized in Trumbull's painting of the Battle of Bunker Hill, the fellow on the left holding the sword. However, unlike many other Connecticut Yankees of similar lineage, but like Cram, Goodhue did not receive a formal education. He was tutored at home in music, history, and the visual arts by his mother, and his only serious academic training came from a brief stint at a less than prestigious preparatory school in New Haven. With the formal schools closed off to him, his architectural education came from apprenticeships, leaving Pomfret for New York City in 1884. Here he faced social ostracism. Architectural society in New York was, with notable exceptions, largely populated by graduates of the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, an institution and style which he held as dry and uninspiring. Goodhue was hired in 1884 by the office of Renwick, Aspinwall, and Russell, a notable firm whose principal architect, James Renwick Jr., designed our Catholic neighbor down the road, St. Patrick's. Goodhue began his career with the lofty title of office boy, but quickly graduated to the draughtsman's tables and became known as an accomplished delineator. Goodhue decided to make his competitive debut in 1889 for the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. Although Goodhue lost the competition to the firm of Hines and Lafarge with Cram, this competition introduced him to Ralph Adams Cram, and would ultimately result in Goodhue joining them in Boston in 1891. Ralph Adams Cram would end up designing the nave of the church 30 years later. Goodhue, Cram, and Ferguson did a significant amount of church building up and down the east and west coasts and published the book Church Building, a catalog of designs identifying the best type for a variety of contexts and settings. Their partnership, although long, was not without friction. These alternate designs for Calvary Episcopal Church in Pittsburgh, the left drawn by Cram, and the right by Goodhue were submitted to the church vestry for approval. Cram's was picked. In 1900, the firm, then called Cram, Goodhue and Ferguson after the death of their first partner Wentworth, was invited to enter the competition for the rebuilding of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, competing against the most prestigious architectural firm of the age, McKim, Mead & White. On top of their impressive reputation, McKim, Mead & White also had the advantage of contributing a previous building to the campus and having the Beaux-Arts training necessary to render orthographic two-dimensional images, as opposed to the axonometric three-dimensional ones that more accurately convey Gothic design. However, Gothic won the day, and the contract was awarded to Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson in May 1902. Goodhue then moved back to New York to open a second office as per the requirements of the contract, and the two partners divided the designs. Cram took on the role of overall planner and designed a few buildings, including the post headquarters, although Goodhue would comment in letters that details of the design were his, and Goodhue did many of the individual buildings, including the West Point Cadet Chapel. This commission took the firm of Cram, Goodhue, and Ferguson to the very highest echelon of architectural practices and let them create an architectural iconography directly from medieval sources and apply it to a modern institutional program. They would prominently express this in the design of St. Thomas, begun in 1907. Cram would lay out the initial plans for the submission, which were then sent to be rendered in the New York office, with Goodhue contributing the ornamental and sculptural composition of the building. The building's structure was entirely masonry base, as opposed to a more modern stone hung from a steel frame. Cram was not opposed to using modern methods of construction, however, which I am sure the workmen were thankful for. Cram decided to retain Upjohn's asymmetric tower and raised it to a height of 15 stories, ensuring the church's presence in the streetscape of Fifth Avenue would not be overwhelmed by the secular buildings going up around it, as he had seen happen while studying inner-city churches in Pittsburgh, Detroit, and Cleveland. The massing and form of the facade are a reference to the central portal of Amiens Cathedral, a strong, imposing tower with a high pointed arch and a rose window above. Cram's second and most notable innovation was the asymmetry of the interior plan. The center of the nave is situated off the center of the lot by about 10 yards, and an aisle chapel runs along the south side of the building behind the tower, while a gallery above references Le Mans Cathedral's two-story Gothic choir. The asymmetry would prove to be a problem, however. Goodhue was stringently opposed to it, writing in correspondence that it was an extremely objectionable feature. However, Cram would not back down and was deeply proud of the innovation. After no less than 12 design revisions over 3 years, the St. Thomas vestry was shown 2 different schemes and made a decision. Cram's was successful. Goodhue accepted the decision, but this conflict would be the end of their partnership. Their separation was concluded in 1913 on amicable terms. The new church was 214 feet long, 100 feet wide. The nave was 43 feet between the piers, and the vaulting of the nave reached 95 feet for a volume that went beyond the width and height of any cathedral in England, a stunning size given the amount of space available on the lot for the church. The seating capacity for the church was around 1,700, including the chantry chapel and the second-floor gallery. The walls of the building are divided into the conventional Gothic pattern of arcade on the bottom, triforium in the center, and clerestory at the top, despite the lack of windows admitting light on the lower 2 sections. The proportions are a reference to the walls of Troyes Cathedral. Another French Gothic reference is the quadripartite groin vaulting on the ceiling, rendered in Rumford Guastavino tiling developed by Harvard professor William Sabine for St. Thomas to accentuate acoustics. Guastavino tiling, prominently featured in Gilded Age Beaux-Arts architecture, was introduced to America by Raphael Guastavino in 1885 and can be seen in many prominent New York landmarks. St. Thomas Church was completed in 1914 to significant acclaim. The most prominent architectural critic of the time, Montgomery Schuyler, sang the praises of St. Thomas in Architectural Record, quoting, "As in all Gothic worthy of the name, the exterior architecture proceeds from the interior requirements. The demands of modern laity have been met by the gallery on one side, and the asymmetry follows. The boldness of this would border on temerity, did it not so clearly proceed from the plan and was justified by the results." Cram's asymmetric gamble had worked. Schuyler did also appreciate the breadth of detail included in the ornament of the building, commenting that the highest praise the decoration can deserve is that it heightens and develops the inherent expression of structure. This praise is fully earned by the detail of St. Thomas. However, works had not been fully completed. In 1925, cracks were discovered in the buttressed arches along the north wind side of the chapel, necessitating reinforcing steel beams to be installed across every column, a pair of columns above the ceiling. Almost simultaneously, the blasting out and construction of the 53rd Street subway station meant that the clerestory windows on the south side, the roof, the nave vaulting, and numerous other assorted problems needed repairs and reinforcements. Cram's valiant attempt at Gothic structure was unfortunately not quite prepared for modern Manhattan. We now come to a discussion of the marginal decorative elements of the church, expressed in sculpture, mosaics, and wood. Decoration, particularly sculpture in cathedrals, is a liturgical program in and of itself. However, as the sacred iconographic program of St. Thomas is a topic worthy of its own lecture, I've chosen instead to focus on the secular references in the mosaics on the floor and carved into the choir stalls. The work of installing these various items was stretched out over the late 1910s and 1920s, funded by Charles Steele, a noted lawyer for J.P. Morgan, who endowed the St. Thomas Choir School in 1925. In order to make up for a lack of a grand window or chevet, ambulatory around the choir space, common feature on many French buildings, which was impossible given that the church backs up on a property line, the decision was taken to decorate the rear of St. Thomas with its most dramatic and obvious interior feature, the reredos. Defining the west end of the church, its effect speaks more to the English perpendicular Gothic, specifically the reredos in All Souls College, Oxford, as opposed to the three-dimensional French rayonnant decoration that defines the facade. The St. Thomas reredos are among the largest in the world and are the largest Gothic example known. The design of the reredos was an entry in a long-standing collaboration between Bertram Goodhue and Lee Laurie, one of the most celebrated sculptors of the time. Laurie was born in Germany in 1877 and immigrated to Chicago in 1882. At age 14, he began as an apprentice to the sculptor Richard Harry Park and quickly graduated to working the White City of the Columbian Exposition of 1893. Laurie's first collaboration with Cram and Goodhue was in 1902 for a public library in Rhode Island, and they came together again for the Cadet Chapel at West Point. The process of designing the reredos forged a lasting friendship between Laurie and Goodhue, notably expressed when the American Institute of Architects attempted to give Goodhue a medal for the design of the reredos. Goodhue returned it and would not accept it until the medal was engraved with both of their names. When Cram and Goodhue split up, Laurie, much more amenable to Goodhue's stylistic evolution, continued working with him on projects across America, including St. Bartholomew's Church on Park Avenue and Goodhue's magnum opus, the Nebraska State Capitol. Laurie's most famous commission, however, was with the architect Raymond Hood at Rockefeller Center, where he created the statue of Atlas and the Wisdom mural. All of the mosaic work was completed by Henry Chapman Mercer and his Moravian Tile Company. Mercer was an archaeologist and industrialist born in 1856 who had become one of the premier adherents of the arts and crafts design movement in America. Mercer had been curator of American and prehistoric archaeology at the University of Pennsylvania in the early 1890s, but left that position to collate his own collection of American artifacts, as well as pursue an apprenticeship in German pottery. After the apprenticeship, Mercer founded the Moravian Pottery Tile Works in 1898, combining his academic and craft studies into a business which became well known across the country. Notable examples of Moravian tile in New York can be seen looking up from Central Park South at the upper stories of the Gainsborough Studios in 1912 and around the Bronx Zoo. Their work can be seen on the right of the balustrade wall between the nave and the chancel, as well as throughout the floor. They are, going from left to right, the first celebration of communion at Jamestown, Virginia, and the American Revolution in Independence Hall in Philadelphia, incongruously placed behind the pulpit base, and then the Capitol in Washington as a symbol of the unification of the United States at the end of the Civil War. Finally, the Cathedral of Notre Dame de Reims, which had been shelled by the Germans and badly damaged during the First World War, was depicted. Dr. Stiers, the rector at the time, had served in the United States Army and had been posted near Reims. This panel is made of the shards of the ruins of the building, as well as other damaged churches of Europe that he brought back with him. Another key medieval decorative area is the wooden carving stalls. While they have liturgical programs along the backs like the facade of reredos, the marginal areas of the stalls would have secular figures represented. Some examples here from Amiens include a pilgrim, an old couple, and minstrels. These wooden carvings were also designed by Goodhue and Laurie and executed by Irving and Cassing of Boston, a significant interior design and furniture company. The secular components of the stalls are a tour through the visual culture of the early 20th century. The first row of carvings sit atop the balustrades. Great authors are represented. The professions of architecture, art, music, and medicine are represented with shields here. We have some infrastructure. And finally, new modes of transportation. In 1827, a full World War I memorial was commissioned, with Lee Laurie returning to render in Art Deco style the Archangel Michael lancing the dragon, representing the evil of war. Below, a bas-relief reflects American soldiers going forth from St. Thomas to France, again represented by Hans Cathedral. Around and below are included the names of the parishioners of St. Thomas who served, and the shields of the branches of the armed services. 16 more shields represent the Allied nations. Poor little New Zealand, sadly omitted, are included embossed on the wooden door itself, which has remained closed since its dedication in honor of the falling. Of about the same date is the baptismal font, the gift of two of the first ever attendees of St. Thomas, John and Alexander Haddon. They are amongst the first wardens of the parish and donated the original marble font in 1831. The font survived the first fire in 1851, but the second conflagration shattered the stone. However, pieces were collected, polished into medallions, and set into the now 8 sides of the current font. The donor, Miss Hamilton McCown Twombly, and her daughters gifted the reredos of the Chantry Chapel, also designed by Goodhue. The shield is inscripted with M.R. Maria Regina, indicating that this chapel is the closest thing to a lady chapel, with St. Mary as its patron. The last piece of decoration is the narthex floor, which features a World War II memorial designed by Francis L.S. Mayers, another close associate of Bertram Goodhue. A floor of marbles and mosaic represents the one globe with the shield of the Allied powers. A small shrine is nearby. As in countless cathedrals across Europe, St. Thomas's stained glass windows were sponsored by well-to-do members of the community to acknowledge and commemorate their connections to their church. The first window of the building was sponsored by Florence Vanderbilt Twombly Burden in memory of her husband Harold. They had married at St. Thomas in 1904, but he sadly fell sick and passed away in 1908 at the age of 31. The artist selected for this window, entitled Faith, was Nicola Diacenzo, an Italian immigrant born in the Abruzzo region of Italy in 1871. Diacenzo modeled this window on examples at Chartres Cathedral, specifically the lancets of the north transept rose window. However, he took the designs and the figures in a more distinct and defined direction than his medieval predecessors would have. Most of the windows of St. Thomas, however, are designed by James Humphreys Hogan, who also laid out the iconographic plans. Born in England in 1883, he apprenticed to the glass firm of James Powell and Sons, later Whitefriars, with whom he would remain for his entire career, creating windows for dozens of church cathedrals across England and America. Founded in 1844, the firm had by the mid-19th century become one of the most important stained glass companies in Great Britain. However, the First World War was not kind to their business, and having already received a commission to the 7 windows of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in 1912, Hogan was sent to New York to attempt to secure further commissions in 1926. While work uptown did not materialize, the St. Thomas windows were approved and orders for production continued through the 1950s. Hogan managed to thread a delicate needle between the medieval precedents and new artistic possibilities. While the compositions were medieval in character, with tall figures fit into lancets and small scenes set in medallions, the figures themselves were notably Art Deco in style, drawn with black paint against the glass. The levels of detail in the faces and on the bodies are more expressive and much more detailed than their medieval equivalents. The iconographic scheme had initially been intended to generally follow the story of the Bible, starting with the creation in the southeast corner and working its way through the prophets, but instead evolved into 3 distinct sections. The north clerestory represents the fruits of the Spirit. Music is out of order so that it might face the organ console. And the south clerestory is the 4 sacraments of ordination, baptism, confirmation, and Holy Communion. The Chantry Chapel is dedicated to holy women, in keeping with its position as the unofficial Mary Chapel, and the gallery windows depict ancient fathers of the church as well as the saint. Quite uniquely, there are no windows at St. Thomas depicting either the Nativity or the Crucifixion. The chancel windows above the reredos were deliberately left abstract. No figures or paintings were included, just a pattern based on medieval medallions. Blue was the primary color chosen to make the glass look further away than it actually is. While this effort is acknowledged now, it ruffled feathers in the 20s. A series of letters to Architecture magazine in late 1931 quarreled over whether the windows were a complimentary rich or a pejorative garish. The most recent major event in the architectural life of St. Thomas was the restoration of the stained glass windows. A study of them in 2005 discovered that the south side was bowing and sagging. Further investigation revealed that the protective glazing installed in the 1970s was both leaking and trapping heat inside the lead putty that holds the glass in place. This meant that the putty, called came, was swelling and would need to be replaced, necessitating the removal of the glass from the frames. The leaks had resulted in water pooling in beneath the glazing elements and the glass itself, trapping dirt, pollution, and smoke in the windows. The trapped heat also had melted some of the cames holding the different glass pieces together, compounding the sagging. Finally, repairs in the intervening decades were not done particularly gently or well. Caulking had been liberally and carelessly applied to leaks, and broken glass had been patched with duct tape. Complicating the repair efforts was the discovery that the waterproofing element used during the original installation of the windows in the 1930s and 40s was a putty made of asbestos. This combination of factors meant that in 2007 the decision was made to fully restore all of the stained glass of the church. Over 2,500 individual panels containing roughly 500,000 pieces of glass, about 10,000 square feet in total. Every piece of glass was to be removed, all the protective glazing was to be stripped, all the lead cames were to be replaced, and the damaged glass was to be restored. Scaffolding was installed in each clerestory to allow for regular church functions to continue, and vinyl screens were hung in each bay to disguise the absence of the windows. The removal of each piece of glass was a complicated affair. A numbering system was established to keep track of the thousands of individual pieces, starting in the southeast corner, with each piece receiving its number before removal to avoid confusion. Numbers were also etched in the lead to ensure that even if the labels were lost, a window was still identifiable. Getting the glass out of the window proved to be the most difficult part of the equation. Normally, the caulking would be chipped out of the limestone setting, freeing the glass, but since this caulking was full of asbestos, this route was not an option. After consultations with glass experts and asbestos abatement firms, decision was taken to cut the glass directly out of the frame, a decision made possible by the inclusion in the glass design of a breakout fillet, a clear border that runs around each stained piece meant to facilitate exactly this procedure, which most medieval glass possesses as well. Although the conservators did not like the destruction, this process was the only way to get the glass out while leaving the asbestos-filled caulk untouched for the abatement. Each piece was photographed, first on site before it was moved, in the studio on a light box, both before and after restoration, and on final reinstallation for a total of 12 shots. The glass then went through the conservation process. A rubbing was made of every section of glass to record every component of the panel in question. All breaks, dirt patterns, paint deterioration was identified through this process. The rubbing was then used to keep track of where each piece belonged. After this, the piece was removed from the lead and soaked to remove grime and imperfections. The pieces were then stored on top of the rubbings so that their locations in the lead frame would not be mistaken. New glass was also made and some select to replace the border fillets and some select pieces that were too damaged to be replaced. The colors and design were matched exactly, and each piece was initialed and dated to establish the provenance of the new glass for future generations. The rubbing was again used to match the glass pieces to the current positions in the cane, and then all the joints were cucked into and underneath the flanges of the other ones, giving the windows a high level of lateral resistance necessary to withstand wind pressure. The new cames were made of an alloy of lead, tin, antimony, and copper to prevent the previous problems of swelling and metal fatigue, as well as to accommodate the difference in sizes between the original Norman glass and the modern, much thinner pieces. After the pieces were soldered, the original waterproofing putty from Whitefriars, England was used, a recipe that has been almost completely the same since the Middle Ages. Each panel had to set for 2 weeks before assembly and testing, first at the glassworking studios and then after reinstallation in the building. Overall, over 2,000 hours were spent on restoration work, excluding removal and renovation, and over 12 studios and hundreds of individuals were involved in the process, led by Julie Sloan, a professor at Columbia's Historic Preservation Program who has led restorations in civic buildings across the country. I will end our time together with a quote my old Gothic professor found by Richard de Forneval, Chancellor of Amiens Cathedral in 1250. "Wherefore God, who so loves man, that he wants to provide for his every need, has given him a particular faculty of mind called memory. Memory has 2 doors, sight and hearing, and to each of these 2 doors a pathway leads, namely depiction and description. Depiction serves the eye, and description serves the ear, and memory renders the past as if it were present. I hope I've been able to convey this morning some of the memories preserved in this building, St. Thomas Church. Thank you. A special thank you to Father Luigi Gioia for asking me to do this, and particularly Inga Rice, who put up with me in the archives very much.
Thank you so much, Cole. As you can see, this is a very detailed and robust, and one of the best things I've heard and seen and on the church after this moment of everything I've seen. So we will do everything we already mentioned to Cole to put this in a proper kind of brochure, some of publication with all the images and everything, so as to make it available to everyone. We have time for one question.
One question.
Just for the burning, I'm sure you have. Is there anyone who would like to ask something?
Such pressure.
Please.
All right.
Can you explain again the reason for the asymmetry? Was it just to be different? I think you said
It was to fit in more people onto the side of the building, because angling it around the corner tower meant that there was space there to have both the lower gallery and the second floor, which he had seen and used in Le Mans to create some extra space. Yeah.
There's another question over there. Okay.
In the church, there's a phrase, grief is the price you pay for love.
Mm-hmm.
And it's from Queen Elizabeth. Can you tell us how she got that job?
I know she came in, she has come to St. Thomas several times. I would have to look up the exact dates, and I would have to do a bit more research into that, into when she would have put that down, because I know she came during, I would guess it would have been when she came during 9/11. For when she came to commemorate the...
I think it is not. I think it is because of 9/11.
Yeah.
Because it's directly underneath the altar memorial of the cross.
Okay.
So I think
Yeah.
it's directly underneath.
Representatives of the royal family also came
Yeah.
when that space was dedicated.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think she was present.
No.
Okay, okay.
She was not.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. And one last question over there. Thank you.
Should Cram and Goodhue be credited equally for the design of the reredos?
No. Cram had nothing to do with the reredos. The reredos was Bertram Grosvenor Goodhue and Lee Laurie, the sculptor.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again, Cole.
Thank you so much. It was really my privilege and my pleasure.
And now the church is calling us. Thank you so much.
Oh, of course.
Amazing.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. So glad.
Thank you so much.
Of
That
course.
was so lovely.
It was my privilege, my pleasure, really.
So one of the things that I'm working on is, it's with Blake, is
Outstanding.
Thank you.
Really
Thank you for your help. I
outstanding.
really appreciate it.
I can't believe how much you got in.
there's and I think the rector